The early years of Diogenes and of Alexander of Macedon read like two opposite stories that later clash on the stage of philosophy. One grew up in the dust of a modest town, the other in the golden halls of a kingdom. Their childhood set the stage for the ways they would see the world, and they still echo in the ideas about freedom and wealth that will be explored later in the video. Diogenes was born around 412 BCE in Sinope, a small port on the Black Sea. His father was a banker, a man who counted coins and cared about trade. The boy watched his father count money, hear the clink of metal, and hear the talk of profit. Yet the family fell into hard times when a storm wrecked the ships that carried their goods. The loss left the household with very little. The young Diogenes learned early that wealth could disappear as fast as a wave. He spent his days walking the streets, watching people argue about money, and listening to the complaints of the poor. One story tells that a neighbor once offered him a piece of bread, and he thanked the giver but asked for nothing more. He seemed to find comfort in the simple act of sharing, not in the size of the loaf. In contrast, Alexander was born 362 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedon. His father, King Philip II, was a powerful ruler who united the Greek city-states under his command. From the moment he entered the world, Alexander was surrounded by soldiers, maps, and the scent of triumph. The palace walls were filled with gifts from allies, with gold, with fine clothing, with exotic animals. A famous anecdote tells that when Alexander was a child, a courtier presented him with a golden cup, a jeweled sword, and a silk cloak. The boy smiled, took the cup, and then placed the sword and cloak aside, saying he would need only the cup for his first drink. This simple act showed a taste for the useful over the flashy, a hint of the focus that would later guide his conquests. Both boys faced choices that shaped their outlook. Imagine two children in a modern playground. One child receives a single wooden block, smooth and plain. The other receives a box full of plastic toys, each bright and noisy. The child with the block may learn to use imagination to find joy in the simple shape. The child with many toys may learn to pick the best, to compare, to desire more. Diogenes grew up with the wooden block, Alexander with the box of toys. The block taught Diogenes to be content with little, to look inside for happiness. The box taught Alexander to see the world as something to be taken, to measure success by the size of the collection. A key moment in Diogenes' youth came when his father sent him to Athens to study philosophy. Athens was the heart of ideas, a city where teachers gathered in the agora, the public square, to discuss what is good and what is just. Diogenes entered a school run by a man named Antisthenes, a follower of Socrates. Antisthenes taught that virtue was the only true good, and that wealth was a distraction. The teacher would often tell his students to live like beggars, to own nothing, to find freedom in lack of desire. Diogenes took these words to heart. He left the school early, walked out of the market, and chose to live on the streets. He began to sleep in a large clay jar, a tub, that he kept in the marketplace of Athens. The story of the tub is told by several ancient writers. One says that Diogenes would sit in the tub, drink water from a cracked cup, and answer questions from passers-by with sharp wit. He would hold a lantern in the daylight, saying he was looking for an honest man. When a wealthy man asked him why he lived in a tub, Diogenes replied, "Because a tub is the only thing that does not demand more than it can give." The tub became a symbol of his belief that a simple life freed the mind from the chains of desire. Alexander's education took a very different path. At the age of 13, his father hired the great philosopher Aristotle to become his tutor. Aristotle was a man who loved to study nature, logic, and the causes of things. He brought with him a library of scrolls, a set of maps, and a method of asking questions that sought clear answers. Aristotle taught Alexander how to think about the world as a series of causes and effects, how to observe the land, how to plan a campaign. He also taught him about ethics, about the good life, but always linked it to the role of a ruler. One of Aristotle's lessons was that a good leader must be both just and strong, that virtue must be paired with power. Alexander absorbed these ideas, and they guided his later ambition to create a world empire. The ancient writer Plutarch records that Aristotle once told Alexander, "You must learn to rule, not only by force, but by the love of your people." Alexander kept this advice close, even as he marched across Persia, Egypt, and India. Both childhood stories contain moments that hint at later philosophical positions. Diogenes' choice to live in a tub shows a belief that external comforts are not needed for a good life. Alexander's lessons from Aristotle show a belief that knowledge and power can be used together to shape the world. Later in the video, the discussion will return to these ideas when looking at how each thinker understood freedom and wealth. Diogenes will be linked to the idea that true freedom comes from letting go of material wants. Alexander will be linked to the idea that wealth can be a tool for expanding freedom, for others and for himself. The contrast between the two lives also invites two counterarguments. The first counterargument says that the environment shapes a person more than any personal choice. Diogenes grew up in poverty, saw his family lose money, and so he chose a simple life. Alexander grew up in wealth, saw power in action, and so he chose conquest. This view holds that the early surroundings push a child toward a certain path, and that personal will is a small factor. The second counterargument claims that temperament, a part of a person's nature, decides the outcome regardless of upbringing. Some say Diogenes was born with a restless spirit that sought truth, and that he would have become a philosopher even if his family had been rich. Others say Alexander was born with a fierce drive to dominate, and that even a poor upbringing could not have stopped his ambition. These opposing views will be explored later when the video looks at how much control a person truly has over their destiny. A second historical anecdote about Diogenes adds depth to his early life. After leaving the school of Antisthenes, he wandered the streets of Corinth, a city known for its trade and wealth. There he met a wealthy merchant who offered him a fine cloak and a place to stay. Diogenes accepted the cloak, but refused the house, saying, "I will wear the cloak, but I will not be tied to a roof." He then walked to the market and set up his tub near the statue of a god. He would greet anyone who passed, saying, "Ask me anything, and I will answer without charge." This story shows his willingness to accept small comforts while rejecting the larger comforts that could limit his freedom. A third anecdote about Alexander's youth shows his early love of learning. When Aristotle taught him about the geography of the world, Alexander would draw maps on the sand, tracing the rivers of the Nile and the mountains of Persia. He asked, "What lies beyond the horizon?" Aristotle answered, "The unknown is a place for brave men to explore." Alexander later recalled this lesson when he crossed the Hindu Kush, saying, "I have always known that the world is larger than any map." This memory of a teacher's simple question stayed with him as he pushed his army forward. Both thinkers also used simple analogies that still make sense today. Diogenes once compared a man's desire for wealth to a dog chasing its own tail. The dog runs fast, but never catches the tail, and ends up exhausted, he said. "A man who chases gold will tire himself, while a man who rests in his own mind will find peace." Alexander, on the other hand, compared a kingdom to a garden. He said, "A garden must be tended, watered, and protected from weeds, or it will wither." This image helped him see his empire as something that needed constant care, not just conquest. Quotes from the primary sources bring these ideas to life. Diogenes is recorded as saying, "Why am looking for an honest man?" This line, spoken while he held a lantern in daylight, captures his belief that truth is rare and worth searching for. Another quote from Diogenes, recorded by Diogenes, states, "The sun, too, is a lamp that does not need oil." He used the sun as a picture of natural light that does not require a fuel, showing that the best things need no extra help. Alexander's words, written by Arian, include, "There is nothing impossible to him who will try." This line shows his confidence that effort can overcome any obstacle. Another quote from Alexander, recorded by Plutarch, says, "I am not afraid of an army of lions. I am afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion." This reflects his view that strong leadership can make a small force powerful. The childhood of Diogenes also includes a story about a simple toy. As a boy, he found a smooth stone in the river and used it as a marble. He would roll it across the sand, making a tiny line of light. He never asked for a fancy toy, because the stone gave him enough joy. The stone became a symbol of his belief that the simplest things can bring the deepest pleasure. In contrast, Alexander, as a child, received a wooden horse model from a visiting diplomat. He spent weeks carving it, painting it, and then using it to practice battle tactics. The wooden horse grew into a symbol of his later strategy at Troy, even though the real Troy story was a myth. The wooden horse shows how a simple gift can spark a lifelong fascination with strategy and conquest. Both lives also show how early experiences can shape a view of wealth. Diogenes' father's loss taught him that money can slip away, and that a life without it can still be full. He later wrote, "Wealth is a burden, not a blessing." Alexander's early exposure to riches taught him that wealth can be a tool for building armies, for building cities, for making a name. He later said, "Gold is the seed from which great deeds grow." These early lessons will be revisited when the video looks at how each thinker thought about freedom and wealth. For Diogenes, freedom meant having no need for gold. For Alexander, wealth meant having the power to create freedom for others. The environment versus temperament debate can be illustrated with a modern example. A child in a poor neighborhood may grow up to become a teacher, choosing to give back, while a child in a rich neighborhood may become a teacher as well, because of an inner love for learning. The environment offers different tools, but the inner drive can choose a path. This mirrors the question of whether Diogenes chose his simple life because of his early poverty, or because of a deeper temperament that rejected excess. It also mirrors the question of whether Alexander would have become a conqueror if he had been raised in a modest home, or whether his inner fire would have pushed him toward greatness regardless. The story of Diogenes Tub also connects to his later ideas about freedom. He once told a rich man, "You can buy a horse, but you cannot buy the wind." "The wind," he said, "is free and cannot be owned." This line will be linked later to the notion that true freedom is not something that can be bought, but something that comes from letting go of desire. Alexander's later claim that "I will create a world where no man will be a slave" ties his wealth to a vision of freedom for others. This claim will be examined in the section on how wealth can be used to expand freedom, or how it can become a chain. The early life of Diogenes also includes an anecdote about his mother. Some sources say his mother was a devout woman. Diogenes of Sinope grew up in a world that prized wealth and power. His father was a banker, but the younger Diogenes chose a different path. He left the city and lived in a barrel on the streets of Athens. He taught that freedom is not something that can be bought or taken by force. For Diogenes, freedom lives inside a person. He said that a free person does not need anything from the outside. He wrote, "I am looking for an honest man." He walked in the bright sun with a lantern, searching for a man who would be true. The lantern was a simple tool. It showed that even in daylight the honest person was hard to find. The story tells that he would turn his lantern toward the crowd and ask, Where is the honest man? The image of a man with a lantern in daylight makes the idea of inner freedom clear. It is a picture of someone who does not need a menu. He can choose his own food without a chef telling him what to eat. Alexander the Great, on the other hand, grew up as a son of a king. He learned that power could be used to open new roads. When he was a boy, he watched his father, Philip of Macedon, plan campaigns. Alexander took those lessons to heart. He believed that a person is free when the world opens up in front of them. He saw borders as walls that keep a person inside a small garden. To break those walls is to be free. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow waterway that separates Europe from Asia, he did more than move an army. He showed that the world could be crossed, that a man could step out of the familiar and claim new lands. He said, "There is nothing impossible to him who will try." The crossing was a powerful image of expanding freedom. It was like a child who decides to walk beyond the playground fence to explore the whole park. Both thinkers used everyday ideas to explain freedom. Diogenes compared it to choosing a meal. Imagine a person in a restaurant with a menu. The menu tells you what is available. If you follow the menu, you eat what the chef suggests. That is a kind of freedom, but it is limited by the chef's choices. Diogenes would say true freedom is like cooking your own meal at home, using only what you need, and tasting only what you like. No one else decides for you. Alexander's view is like a traveler who wants to try every dish in the world. He does not stay at one table. He wants to taste the spice of Persia, the sweet of Egypt, the sour of India. He believes that the more places you can go, the more free you become. The traveler's freedom is measured by the number of borders crossed. The origins of these ideas go back to the early lives of the two men. Diogenes grew up in a city where trade and wealth were the norm. He saw that people were chained to money, to status, to the opinions of others. He chose to throw those chains away. He lived in a barrel, ate simple food, and slept on the ground. He wanted to show that a person can be happy with nothing. Alexander grew up in a royal court where power was displayed in grand feasts and military parades. He learned that power can move mountains. He watched his father use soldiers to protect the kingdom. He decided that a ruler who can move armies across seas can also move his own limits. For him, freedom grew from the ability to command, to expand, to bring more people under his rule. The arguments each thinker made are clear. Diogenes argued that inner freedom is the only real freedom. He said that external things can be taken away, but the mind remains. He used the lantern story to show that honesty and virtue are rare, but they are the true guides to a free life. He claimed that if a person can live without needing wealth, without needing fame, then no ruler can control that person. He wrote, "I do not need any of the things that people say are necessary." The point is that a free mind does not need a menu. It can choose its own ingredients. Alexander argued that external freedom is also essential. He believed that a strong state protects its people. He said that when a ruler expands borders, the people inside enjoy safety and prosperity. The crossing of the Hellespont was not just a military move. It was a statement that the world can be opened up. He thought that a person who can travel far, who can bring back new ideas, who can protect his people from danger, is truly free. He once told his soldiers, "We will not stop until the world is ours." For Alexander, freedom was a shared experience. The more land a ruler held, the more resources could be shared with the people, the more choices they would have. There are counter-arguments to each view. One counter-argument to Diogenes' claim is that external security can help a person find inner peace. If a city is constantly under threat, a person may not have the calm needed to look inside. A strong ruler who protects the borders can give citizens the space to think about themselves. In that sense, Alexander's idea that expanding borders brings security can actually support inner freedom. A safe environment can let a person practice the kind of self-reliance Diogenes praised. The argument says that freedom is not just a personal choice, but also a condition of the world around a person. A second counter-argument to Alexander's view is that total independence can lead to isolation. If a ruler keeps adding lands, the ruler may become detached from the simple life that gives true happiness. The more power one has, the more people may fear the ruler, and the less honest conversation can happen. A ruler who is surrounded by armies may find that no one can speak truth to him. That isolation can make the ruler feel trapped by his own empire. The argument says that expanding borders may give the appearance of freedom, but it can also create a cage of responsibilities and fears. Real-world applications of these ideas can be seen today. Think of a person who chooses a career that lets them work from home, set their own hours, and avoid a corporate hierarchy. That person follows Diogenes' idea of inner freedom. They are not tied to a boss's menu of tasks. They cook their own meal of work. On the other hand, consider a country that joins a trade bloc, opens its borders, and allows its citizens to travel freely across many nations. That country follows Alexander's view that expanding borders creates more options for its people. Citizens can study abroad, work in different markets, and enjoy a wider range of products. Both approaches show how the old ideas still matter. Modern interpretations keep the same core. Some philosophers say that true freedom is a balance of inner autonomy and external opportunity. They quote Diogenes to remind people to keep their inner compass, and they quote Alexander to remind people that a supportive environment matters. In contemporary politics, leaders who focus on human rights often speak of freedom from oppression, echoing Diogenes. Leaders who focus on economic growth and global influence often speak of freedom to expand, echoing Alexander. Examples help to illustrate the point. One example is a student who decides to study philosophy instead of a high-paying job. The student says, "I want to think for myself, not just chase money." That is a modern Diogenes. Another example is an entrepreneur who builds a multinational company that brings jobs to many countries. The entrepreneur says, "I want to open doors for people everywhere." That is a modern Alexander. Both examples show that the same ideas can appear in different forms. Analogies make the ideas easier to grasp. Imagine a bird in a cage. The cage is a set of rules, expectations, and external pressures. If the bird learns to sing inside the cage, it finds a kind of inner freedom. That is Diogenes' view. If the bird breaks the cage and flies over many fields, it experiences a wider world. That is Alexander's view. The bird can feel safe in the cage, but it may never see the sunrise over the mountains. The bird that flies can see many suns, but it may also face storms. The balance of the two pictures helps a listener understand why both thinkers matter. Historical anecdotes add color. The first anecdote is the story of Diogenes walking in broad daylight with a lantern. He walked through the busy market of Athens, holding the light as if it were a torch searching for truth. He asked passers-by, "Where is the honest man?" Many laughed. Some thought he was crazy. Yet the story survived because it showed how Diogenes valued inner honesty above all else. The second anecdote is the crossing of the Hellespont by Alexander. He stood on the shore, looked at the narrow strait, and ordered his men to build a bridge. He then led his army across, showing that no water was too big to cross. The act was a bold claim that the world could be reshaped. Both anecdotes illustrate the core ideas of each thinker. Quotes from primary sources give voice to the thinkers. Diogenes is recorded as saying, "I am looking for an honest man." He also said, "I have no need of anything." Alexander is recorded as saying, There is nothing impossible to him who will try." He also told his troops, "We will not stop until the world is ours." These lines are short, but they carry the weight of each philosophy. Linking back to their early lives, the story of Diogenes' birth in a wealthy family shows why he turned away from material things. He saw that wealth could bind a person. His later life in a barrel shows his commitment to inner freedom. Alexander's early training by Aristotle gave him a love of learning and a belief that the world could be understood and mastered. His early victories in battle taught him that power could be used to protect and expand. Those early experiences shaped their later ideas about freedom. Looking forward, their attitudes toward power still echo today. Diogenes warned against letting power dictate one's inner life. He would likely criticize a modern leader who uses wealth to silence critics. Alexander's attitude suggests that power can be a tool to bring people together, to share ideas, to protect. He would likely praise a leader who uses influence to open borders and create opportunities. Both perspectives remind us that freedom is not a simple word. It can mean inner calm, it can mean external reach, it can mean a mix of both. In daily life, a person can practice Diogenes' freedom by limiting possessions, by questioning what truly matters, by finding peace in simple acts like cooking a meal at home. A person can practice Alexander's freedom by learning new languages, by traveling, by building connections across cultures. Both paths can lead to a richer life. The concept of freedom, as seen through Diogenes and Alexander, is a conversation that has lasted for centuries. One says that the mind is the only place that cannot be taken away. The other says that the world can be opened up to give more choices. Both have strengths and weaknesses. The balance between inner autonomy and external opportunity is still being explored. The ideas of a man with a lantern and a man who crossed a strait still speak to anyone who wonders what it means to be truly free. The story of freedom continues, inviting each listener to decide whether to cook their own meal, to follow a menu, or to cross new waters, or perhaps to do both. The story of Diogenes of Sinope and Alexander the Great reads like a meeting of two opposite worlds. One world lives with almost nothing. The other gathers more than any city could hold. Both men thought a lot about wealth, about what it means to own things, and about how those ideas shape a life. In the part of the lesson that talks about ethics, the question is whether a good life needs material goods. In the part that talks about power, the question is how much power comes from having treasure. By looking at the two lives, the viewer can see how each answer works in practice. Diogenes walked the streets of Athens with a lantern in broad daylight. He said he was looking for an honest man. He owned a single cloak, a simple bowl, and a small wooden tub. He liked to sit in the market and watch the rich men argue about how much gold they had. He would often say, "I have nothing, and that is why I am free." The calm tone of his voice made the crowd think about what it means to be free. In the ethics section, his view is called Cynicism. Cynicism means living as simply as possible so that nothing can disturb the mind. It is not a joke about being angry. It is a serious plan to stay calm and honest. Alexander, on the other hand, grew up as the son of King Philip of Macedon. He learned to ride a horse before he could read. By the time he was 20, he had already taken the throne and started a campaign that would stretch from Greece to India. He loved gold, fine clothes, and fine food. He built palaces in Babylon, filled them with marble and precious stones, and gave gifts of gold to the people he conquered. In the power section, his style is called imperial ambition. Imperial ambition means using power and wealth to shape the world. Alexander believed that a ruler should show strength by showing wealth. A simple modern example helps to picture the clash. Imagine a family that decides to have a picnic in a public park. They bring a blanket, some fruit, and a bottle of water. The cost is low, but the feeling of being together is rich. Now picture another family that chooses a fancy restaurant on a high street. They pay for a table, a menu of many courses, and a bottle of wine. The money spent is high, but the taste of the food and the view of the city are also part of the experience. The first family lives more like Diogenes, the second more like Alexander. Both families enjoy the day, but they do it in different ways. One famous anecdote about Diogenes shows his refusal to accept even a small gift. A wealthy man offered him a bowl of lentils, hoping to win his favor. Diogenes looked at the bowl, then at the man, and said, "Why have no need for this?" He turned away and walked on, leaving the lentils on the ground. The story is recorded by Diogenes' student, who wrote, "When a man offers a gift, I ask whether he seeks a debt." The point is clear. A gift can become a trap that ties a person to a debt. In the ethics section, this story is used to argue that a person can stay free by refusing to own even small things that could bind them. A second anecdote about Alexander shows the opposite view. After the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander's army captured the Persian treasury. He ordered the gold to be divided among his soldiers, saying, "Let every man take his share, and let the city hear of our generosity." The soldiers cheered. The people of the city saw a new ruler who could give, and the empire grew stronger. The ancient historian Arrian wrote, "Alexander's hand was quick to give, and his heart was quick to receive." In the power section, this story is used to argue that wealth can be a tool for building loyalty and for making a ruler's power last. Both stories have a lesson about how wealth can shape a life. Diogenes' refusal of lentils shows that a person can keep a clear mind when they do not own many things. Alexander's distribution of gold shows that a ruler can win support when he shares his treasure. The two ideas can be tested against each other in today's world. One counterargument to Diogenes' view says that wealth can fund good deeds. A modern charity can buy medicine, food, and shelter for people who need help. If a person has no money, they may have to rely on others, and the help may be limited. The argument is that having some wealth does not automatically corrupt a person. It can give a person the power to do good on a larger scale. In the ethics section, this view is called beneficent wealth. It says that the moral value of wealth depends on how it is used, not on the fact that it exists. A second counterargument to Alexander's view says that extreme wealth can limit options. When a ruler has to protect a huge treasure, they may become afraid to take risks. They may spend time protecting gold instead of listening to the needs of their people. A person who owns many things may feel trapped by the need to keep those things safe. In the power section, this idea is called the burden of riches. It says that a ruler who is too attached to wealth may lose the freedom to act wisely. A third anecdote from ancient Greece adds depth to the story. When Diogenes was asked by a king why he lived in a barrel, he answered, "Because a barrel is the only thing that does not ask for more." The king laughed, but the story spread through the city. It reminded people that a simple home can be a shield against greed. The anecdote appears in the writings of Diogenes' friend, who recorded, "The barrel does not demand a price, and the man who lives in it asks for nothing." This story is often used in the ethics section to illustrate how a small shelter can protect a mind from the desire for more. A fourth anecdote about Alexander shows a different side of his wealth. After conquering Egypt, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria. He ordered that a library be built, filled with scrolls from many lands. He spent a great deal of gold on scholars, on ships, and on teachers. The library became a place where ideas could travel across the world. The historian Plutarch wrote, Alexander's love of gold was matched by his love of knowledge. This story shows that wealth can also be a seed for learning and culture. In the power section, it is used to argue that a ruler can use riches to build lasting institutions, not just to buy loyalty. The two philosophies can be compared with a simple analogy. Think of a garden. Diogenes tends a garden of wild herbs. He does not plant expensive flowers, but he knows each plant's need. The garden grows without much water or fertilizer, and the herbs are always there for anyone who needs them. Alexander tends a garden of gold roses. He waters them with rich soil, spends much money on them, and the roses look beautiful. But if a storm comes, the roses may be broken, and the garden may need more money to repair. The analogy shows that both gardens can bring beauty, but they need different kinds of care. In the modern world, the ideas still appear. Some people choose to live in tiny homes, to own only a bike and a laptop. They say that owning less gives them more time to think, to write, to be with friends. Others choose to invest in stocks, to buy a house, to collect art. They say that wealth gives them security and the ability to help others when they want to. Both choices can be good, but each follows a different line of thought that started with Diogenes and Alexander. A quote from Diogenes that fits the discussion is, "He who possesses the most is the slave of his possessions." The words are simple, but they carry a strong idea. A quote from Alexander that fits the discussion is, Gold is the measure of a man's success." Both quotes are short, and both can be repeated in a classroom to spark a debate about whether wealth is a chain or a tool. When the two ideas meet, a question appears. Can a person have both freedom from greed and the power to help others? Some thinkers say yes. They suggest a middle path where a person owns enough to act, but not so much that they become attached. The middle path is often called moderate wealth. It is a way to keep the mind clear while still having the means to do good. In the ethics section, the middle path is described as a balance between desire and duty. The story of Diogenes refusing a bowl of lentils and the story of Alexander sharing gold after Gaugamela both end with a lesson about choice. Diogenes chose to stay poor, and his mind stayed calm. Alexander chose to share his riches, and his empire grew stronger. Both choices were made on purpose, not by accident. The viewer can see that wealth is not just about numbers, but about what a person decides to do with it. In the final part of the segment, the narrator invites the audience to picture a day in a park. The sun is warm, a child runs with a kite, a couple shares a sandwich, a man reads a book. No one carries a chest of gold, yet the day feels rich. Then the narrator asks the audience to picture a grand hall, with chandeliers made of crystal, a feast with many dishes, and a ruler who stands at the head of the table, holding a golden cup. Both scenes are full of life, but they speak to different ideas about wealth. The lesson from Diogenes and Alexander is that wealth can be a tool, a trap, a sign of power, or a sign of freedom, depending on how it is used. The ethics section reminds viewers that a good life does not need many things. The power section reminds viewers that a ruler can use treasure to build loyalty and culture. By comparing the two lives, the viewer can see that the same gold can be a gift or a chain, that the same bowl can be a comfort or a debt. The segment ends with a quiet thought. A man who can smile without a coin is richer than a man who owns a mountain of gold and cannot smile. The words close the story, leaving the audience with a gentle reminder that the value of a life is measured not by the weight of its treasure, but by the lightness of its heart. The story of power can be told with two very different characters. One is a man who walked the streets of Athens with a lantern looking for an honest person. The other is a king who rode a horse across 3 continents and called himself the ruler of the world. Their names are Diogenes of Sinope and Alexander the Great. The way each of them treated authority shows two opposite attitudes toward power. Imagine a school. A teacher asks for a class monitor. One student steps forward, smiles, and says, "I will keep the class in order." Another student shrugs, puts the book down, and says, "I do not want that job." The first student is like Alexander. He wants the role, wants to guide, wants the respect that comes with it. The second student is like Diogenes. He does not want the badge, does not want the expectations that come with it. This simple picture helps to see how each thinker saw power. Diogenes lived in a barrel, owned almost nothing, and said that a good life is one free from need. He believed that true freedom comes from not being tied to any ruler, any law, any possession. In one famous story, Alexander arrived in Corinth. He was a young king, fresh from victories, and he wanted to meet the famous philosopher. He found Diogenes lying in the sun, his simple bowl in his hand. Alexander walked up, bowed, and said, "King, I am Alexander, son of Philip." Diogenes opened one eye, looked at the king, and said, "Stand out of my sunlight." The words were short, but they cut deep. Diogenes was not afraid of the king's power. He simply wanted the space to be himself. The story shows a man who refused to be impressed by rank. He saw the king's authority as something that could be ignored if it did not help him live simply. Alexander's view of power was different. When he was crowned king of Asia, the priests placed a golden diadem on his head, and the crowd shouted his name. He felt that power was a tool, a way to bring order and greatness to the world. He once said, "There is nothing impossible to him who will try." For Alexander, power meant the ability to shape history, to bring cities to life, to spread ideas. He believed that a ruler could use his strength to create a better world. He built cities, spread Greek culture, and tried to unite different peoples under one rule. Both men talked about freedom. Diogenes said, "I am looking for an honest man." The search was not for a person, but for a life without lies, without pretenses. He thought that freedom meant not being owned by anything, not even by a ruler's favor. Alexander, on the other hand, saw freedom as the chance to act without fear. He wanted to be free to travel, to fight, to decide the fate of nations. He believed that a strong leader could protect the freedom of those who followed him. The first counter-argument to Diogenes' rejection of power is that power can be used responsibly. A ruler who cares about his people can bring peace, build roads, and protect the weak. Alexander's conquests, though violent, also created a network of trade, shared ideas, and new opportunities for many. Some say that without a strong hand, chaos would have taken over the lands he united. In this view, refusing power means missing the chance to guide society towards safety and progress. The argument says that a wise leader can keep order and still respect the freedom of individuals. The second counter-argument to Alexander's eager embrace of power is that seeking authority can blind a person to the needs of ordinary people. When a leader is focused on expanding his empire, he may ignore the suffering of those he conquers. Critics point to the destruction of cities, the loss of lives, and the forced cultural changes that happened under Alexander's rule. They argue that refusing personal power, as Diogenes did, can keep a person honest and prevent the misuse of influence. In this view, rejecting power is not a sign of weakness, but a way to stay true to ethical values. The two stories also connect to the idea of ethics. Diogenes lived by a simple code. Live with as little as possible, do not harm others, and do not ask for more than needed. He believed that ethics comes from inner freedom, not from laws made by a ruler. Alexander's ethics were more about duty to his people, duty to his ancestors, and duty to the gods. He thought that a leader must act bravely, even if the act caused pain, because the larger goal was the good of the whole. A second anecdote about Diogenes adds depth to his view of power. One day, a rich man offered Diogenes a large sum of money to move out of the public square. Diogenes laughed, took the money, and then threw it into the street, saying, "Let the poor have a chance to pick it up." He did not accept the gift because it would tie him to a patron. He showed that accepting wealth could become a form of power over him. By refusing, he kept his independence. This story shows how even small offers of power can be rejected to keep freedom. A second anecdote about Alexander shows his confidence in power. After the Battle of Gaugamela, he stood on a hill and looked over the defeated Persian army. He told his men, "We have shown the world that a small force can defeat a great one." He used the victory to claim the title of King of Asia. The moment was a clear display of how power can be turned into a message that inspires others. He believed that his success would encourage his soldiers to follow him further, trusting in his ability to lead. To bring the ideas into modern life, think of a manager at a company. One manager takes the top spot, makes decisions, and tries to grow the business. Another manager chooses to stay out of the spotlight, works on the floor, and helps co-workers without seeking promotion. The first manager is like Alexander, using authority to shape direction. The second manager is like Diogenes, preferring to stay free from the pressures that come with a title. Both can be effective, but their attitudes toward power differ. Another modern example comes from politics. A politician who runs for office, promises to change laws, and seeks the power to vote on big issues follows Alexander's path. A citizen who refuses to run, who instead volunteers, speaks out, and lives simply, follows Diogenes' path. Both can influence society, but one does it from the top, the other from the bottom. The idea of freedom also appears in everyday choices. A teenager may be offered a leadership role in a school club. Accepting the role means more responsibility, more chance to shape the club's direction. Declining means more time for personal hobbies, less stress, and staying true to personal interests. The teenager's decision mirrors the ancient debate. Is it better to take power and try to improve the group, or stay free from that burden and keep personal peace? When the two thinkers are compared, a pattern emerges. Diogenes treats power as a trap that can steal a person's inner peace. He sees the world as a place where true happiness comes from not needing anything from others. Alexander treats power as a tool that can be used to build, to protect, and to leave a mark on history. He sees the world as a place where a strong hand can guide many people toward a common goal. The contrast also raises a question about responsibility. If a person refuses power, does he avoid responsibility for the suffering of others? If a person takes power, does he become responsible for every outcome, good or bad? Diogenes would answer that responsibility lies in living honestly and not causing harm. Alexander would answer that responsibility lies in using one's strength to create order and protect the people. A quote from Diogenes, recorded by the historian Diogenes Laertius, says, "I am looking for an honest man." The short line shows his search for truth, not for fame. A quote from Alexander, recorded by the historian Arrian, says, "I would rather live a short life as a king than a long life as a slave." The words reveal his belief that power, even with its risks, is worth the sacrifice. Both quotes highlight how each man measured the value of power. Diogenes measured it against honesty and inner peace. Alexander measured it against freedom from servitude and the chance to shape the world. When the two ideas meet, a middle path can appear. A person might accept some authority, but only to protect the freedom of others. He might lead a project, like a student who volunteers to be class monitor, but does so with the aim of helping classmates, not of gaining personal glory. This middle path respects both the need for order and the need for personal freedom. In the end, The story of Diogenes and Alexander shows that power is not a single thing. It can be a burden, a chance, a tool, or a trap. How each person reacts depends on what they value most. If they value inner peace and independence, they may follow Diogenes. If they value influence and the ability to shape events, they may follow Alexander. The choice is personal, and each choice carries its own set of consequences. The lesson for anyone listening is simple. Look at the power around you. Ask whether it helps you stay true to your values or whether it pulls you away from them. Remember the student who refused the monitor role because he wanted to study, and the student who took the role because he wanted to help his friends. Both made choices that fit their own sense of what was right. In the same way, Diogenes and Alexander each acted according to their own view of what power meant. By keeping the story clear, by using everyday pictures, and by sharing the ancient words, the tale of power becomes a guide for modern life. It shows that power can be used wisely, but also that refusing power can be a wise act. The balance between the two ideas can lead to a life that respects both freedom and responsibility. The story ends not with a single answer, but with an invitation to think about how each person will meet authority in their own life. Diogenes of Sinope walked the streets of Athens with a lantern in broad daylight. He said he was looking for an honest man. The lantern was a simple picture of his belief that honesty should be as clear as light. He lived in a barrel, ate only what he could find, and once he took a plucked chicken and ate it as a meal because no one offered him a bowl. This act showed his view that a person should be self-sufficient and not depend on others for comfort. He believed that a good life is one that needs little, that a person can meet his own needs with what nature gives. Alexander the Great, on the other hand, grew up as a king of Macedonia. He was taught that a ruler must be brave, that he must protect his people, and that his duty was to lead them to greatness. He saw his role as a heroic one, a duty to his army and his city-states. When his soldiers fell in battle, Alexander would stop the march, bow his head, and say that they had earned a place in memory. He built a tomb for his beloved horse Bucephalus, and he ordered a grand funeral for his friend Hephaestion. In these acts he showed that loyalty and duty were the highest virtues for him. Both men talked about virtue, but they used very different words. Diogenes said that virtue is found in self-sufficiency, in being honest with oneself and with others, and in not asking for more than what is needed. Alexander said that virtue is found in heroic duty, in loyalty to the group, and in the willingness to sacrifice for a larger goal. The two ideas can be shown with a simple snack example. Imagine a child with a bag of cookies. The child who shares the cookies with a friend shows a kind of loyalty and duty to the friend. The child who keeps all the cookies for himself shows a desire for personal comfort. Diogenes would say that the child who shares is being honest about his need. He does not need all the cookies to be happy. Alexander would say that the child who shares is doing his duty to the friend, showing loyalty. The story of Diogenes and Alexander meeting in Corinth gives a clear picture of their clash. Alexander rode up on a horse, surrounded by soldiers, and asked the philosopher if there was anything he could do for him. Diogenes, lying in the sun, said, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." This short reply showed that Diogenes valued his own peace more than any gift from a powerful king. He was honest, even if his words could hurt Alexander's pride. The story also shows how a powerful ruler can be humbled by a simple truth. The anecdote is used often to illustrate the power of honesty over wealth. Alexander's respect for his fallen soldiers also tells a story about duty. After the Battle of Issus, he walked among the dead, lifted a wounded soldier's arm, and said, "You have served well." He ordered that the soldier's body be carried home with honor. In doing so, he showed that loyalty to his men mattered more than the cost of slowing his campaign. He believed that a leader must keep his promise to those who fight for him. This is the heroic duty that Alexander taught. Both teachings have modern echoes. In a workplace, a manager who asks a team member to stay late because the project needs it is showing a sense of duty. The employee who says, "I cannot stay, I have a family dinner," is showing self-sufficiency and honesty about personal limits. The manager may see the employee as not loyal, while the employee may see the manager as demanding. The tension between duty and self-sufficiency still appears in everyday life. One counter-argument to Diogenes' strict honesty is that it can hurt feelings. If a friend asks for an opinion on a new haircut, and the honest answer is, "It does not suit you," the friend may feel embarrassed. Diogenes would say that truth is more important than comfort, but many people think that kindness should sometimes soften truth. The argument says that honesty without care can break trust. A modern example is a teacher who tells a student that their essay is poor. The teacher's intention may be to help, but the student may feel discouraged. So the balance between honesty and compassion is a point of debate. A second counterargument to Alexander's heroic duty is that it can be used to justify harsh actions. A leader may claim that a war is necessary because of duty to protect the nation. In that view, any suffering caused by the war is allowed. Alexander himself ordered the destruction of the city of Tyre after a long siege. He said it was necessary for his duty to secure his empire. Critics say that using duty as an excuse can hide selfish ambition. The argument warns that duty must be checked by moral limits, otherwise it becomes a shield for cruelty. Both philosophers also wrote about the role of wealth. Diogenes famously said, "He has the most who is content with the least." He believed that wealth can trap a person in false needs. Alexander, however, collected gold, cities, and art as symbols of his power. He built the city of Alexandria, a place of wealth and learning. The two views show how wealth can be seen as a tool for virtue or a distraction from it. In the earlier discussion on wealth and power, the contrast between a simple life and a grand empire was explored. Diogenes used his lack of wealth to show freedom, while Alexander used wealth to show strength. A simple analogy can help. Think of a garden. Diogenes tends a small pot of herbs that needs little water and can survive on its own. Alexander tends a large field that needs irrigation, workers, and fences. Both gardens produce food, but the small pot shows independence, while the large field shows responsibility to many. The pot does not need a manager. The field needs a farmer who decides when to plant and when to harvest. The two gardens illustrate self-sufficiency and duty side by side. Another analogy uses a lamp. Diogenes held a lamp in daylight to show that honesty shines even when it seems unnecessary. The lamp is a symbol of truth that does not need darkness to be seen. Alexander's lamp would be a torch that lights a path for a group of travelers. The torch's purpose is to guide many, even if it burns brighter than needed for one person. The two lamps show how truth can be personal or communal. Historical anecdotes add depth. When Diogenes was asked why he lived in a barrel, he replied, "Because a barrel is cheaper than a house." The reply shows his belief that comfort is not worth extra cost. He also once pretended to be a dog, walking on all fours, to mock those who pretended to be wise. By acting like a dog, he reminded people that natural behavior is better than false pretenses. These stories illustrate his commitment to honesty and simplicity. Alexander's life is full of similar stories. After the Battle of Gaugamela, he walked through the Persian palace and ordered that the royal treasury be opened. He gave some of the gold to his soldiers as a reward, saying that they deserved a share of the victory. He also visited the oracle of Ammon in the desert and asked for guidance. The oracle told him that he would be a great king, and Alexander took the words as a sign of his destiny. These episodes show his belief that duty includes rewarding those who serve him and seeking guidance for his actions. Quotes from primary sources bring the ideas to life. Diogenes is recorded as saying, "I am looking for an honest man." The line appears in the writings of Diogenes Laertius. Another quote from Diogenes is, "Well, the sun, too, is a source of wealth, but it does not ask for tribute." This short sentence shows his view that nature provides enough for those who are content. From Alexander, the historian Arrian records him saying, "There is nothing impossible to him who will try." The quote reflects his belief in heroic effort and duty to achieve great things. Another line from Alexander's own letters reads, "I will share the spoils with those who fought beside me." This shows his sense of loyalty to his men. When the two ideas meet, a question arises. Which path leads to a better life? The answer may depend on the situation. In a war, the heroic duty of Alexander can keep a group safe. In a peaceful town, the self-sufficiency of Diogenes can keep a person free from greed. The video can show a scene where a child chooses to share a snack with a friend. The child's act can be seen as both honest, the child does not need the whole snack, and loyal, the child cares for the friend. The scene blends the two philosophies. The moral teaching of Diogenes also includes the idea that honesty must be practiced even when it is uncomfortable. He once walked into the marketplace and shouted, "Rule all fools!" The crowd was shocked. But he meant that people often hide behind false appearances. The lesson is that truth can be a mirror that shows us who we really are. In modern terms, a social media post that calls out a lie can be seen as a Diogenian act. It may upset some, but it can also bring clarity. Alexander's moral teaching about loyalty can be seen when he ordered his troops to build a bridge over the Oxus River. He said that crossing the river was a duty to the empire, and that each soldier must help. The bridge later became a trade route that helped many people. The story shows that duty can create benefits beyond the immediate goal. In a modern setting, a volunteer who helps build a community garden is acting with a sense of duty to improve the neighborhood. Both teachings also speak to the idea of sacrifice. Diogenes gave up a comfortable home to live in a barrel, showing that personal comfort can be sacrificed for honesty. Alexander gave up his own safety many times on the battlefield, showing that a leader may sacrifice personal life for the group. The two sacrifices look different, but both are meant to serve a higher purpose. The discussion can also link back to wealth and power. Diogenes argued that a person who owns many things is often a slave to those things. He said, "The rich man is a slave to his riches." Alexander, however, used his wealth to fund cities, libraries, and armies. He believed that wealth could be a tool for power and for spreading culture. The contrast raises the question, is wealth a burden or a resource? The answer may lie in how it is used. If wealth is used to help others, it can be a form of duty. If wealth is hoarded for personal pleasure, it can trap a person in false needs. A modern example of Diogenian honesty can be seen in a whistleblower who exposes a company's wrongdoing. The person may lose a job, but the truth helps society. The act shows self-sufficiency in moral courage and honesty even when it hurts. A modern example of Alexander's heroic duty can be seen in a firefighter who runs into a burning building to save strangers. The firefighter risks personal safety for the duty to protect the community. Both examples illustrate how the ancient ideas still apply. The video can also explore how the two philosophies handle conflict. If two friends argue over a toy, a Diogenian approach would have each friend state honestly why they want the toy, perhaps realizing that they do not need it. An Alexander-like approach would have one friend take responsibility for protecting the other, perhaps offering to share the toy as a duty. Both paths can end the conflict, but they do so in different ways. A final anecdote about Diogenes shows him walking around the city with a bowl, asking for food. When a passerby offered a crust, Diogenes said, "Give it to the dog." He meant that the crust was too small for a human. The story of education in ancient Greece is often told as a clash of two very different ways of learning. One path is the road that Diogenes of Sinope walked, a road made of streets, markets, and the everyday hustle of the city. The other path is the road that Alexander of Macedon followed, a road built of lectures, scrolls, and the quiet study of a famous teacher. Both men grew up under very different circumstances, and both believed that knowledge could shape a life, but they showed the world very different ideas about how that knowledge should be gained. Earlier in the series, the early lives of the two figures were described. Diogenes was born into a wealthy family, but a sudden loss of money forced him to live on the streets. He chose to reject the comforts of a home and instead lived in a large ceramic jar, a symbol of his belief that true freedom came from having little. Alexander, on the other hand, was born into a royal family, the son of King Philip of Macedon. From a young age he was surrounded by tutors, soldiers, and the expectation that he would become a ruler. When the story moves to the subject of education, the contrast becomes even sharper. Diogenes taught by doing. He did not sit in a classroom. He walked through the agora, the marketplace, and he watched how people bought, sold, and argued. He would pick up a broken pot and repair it with his own hands, showing that a skill can be learned by practice. He would sit in the shade of a tree and watch a child learn to ride a wooden cart. He would then say, "The child learns by feeling the balance, not by reading a book about balance." This simple image works like a picture of learning to ride a bike. When a child first rides a bike, the child does not read a long manual first. The child climbs onto the seat, pushes the pedals, feels the wobble, and learns to stay upright. The child's body remembers the feeling of balance, and the mind learns the idea of control through that feeling. Diogenes believed that most of life works the same way. He believed that the mind grows best when it is attached to the body's real experience. A story that shows this method comes from an old anecdote recorded by a later writer. One day a young man approached Diogenes and asked, "Teach me how to live a good life." Diogenes did not answer with a long speech. Instead, he took the young man to a river and asked him to fetch water with his hands. The young man reached in, felt the cold flow, and brought the water to the jar. Diogenes then said, "You have learned how to bring water without a bucket. That is the first lesson of life. Use what you have and learn by doing." The story ends with the young man smiling, because he sees that the lesson was not a lecture, but a lived act. The anecdote is often quoted to show that Diogenes' teaching was always about example, not about theory. Alexander's education was very different. When he was a boy, his father hired the famous philosopher Aristotle to be his tutor. Aristotle's school, the Lyceum, was a place where students sat on wooden benches, listened to lectures, and read scrolls. Aristotle taught Alexander about logic, about the nature of the world, about the forms of government, and about the art of war. He gave Alexander a list of books to read, and he asked him to write essays about the ideas he found. In this way, Alexander's mind was filled with theories before he ever set foot on a battlefield. Aristotle's method was to give a clear set of ideas, then ask the student to think about them, to argue, and to write. This is like reading a manual before building a piece of furniture. The manual tells where each piece goes, which screw fits where, and how the whole thing should look when it is finished. The builder can then follow the plan and create a stable chair without guessing. A famous anecdote from Alexander's youth illustrates this formal style. While he was still a teenager, a group of philosophers from the city of Alexandria visited his palace to discuss the nature of virtue. Alexander, having just finished a lesson on the concept of the golden mean, which means finding a middle point between excess and deficiency, asked the philosophers, "Is it better to be brave or to be cautious?" The philosophers argued back and forth, quoting the works of earlier thinkers. Alexander listened, asked questions, and then gave his own answer, saying, "Our leader must be brave enough to act, but cautious enough to think." The story shows that Alexander's learning was built on dialogue, on hearing many points of view, and on forming his own ideas from the words of others. It also shows that his education gave him a habit of debating, a skill he would later use to command armies and to persuade his officers. The two approaches can be compared with two everyday images. The first image is that of a child learning to ride a bike. The child climbs on, feels the wobble, falls, gets up, and finally rides smoothly. The child's mind learns the idea of balance through the body's feeling. This is the experiential method, the one Diogenes praised. The second image is that of a person reading a bike assembly manual before trying to put the bike together. The manual tells where each bolt belongs, what each part does, and how the whole bike should work. This is the formal method, the one Alexander received from Aristotle. Both images lead to the same end, a working bike, but the road taken is different. There are good reasons to support each side. One argument in favor of formal study is that it can give a person a map of ideas that would otherwise be hidden. Aristotle's lessons gave Alexander a framework for thinking about politics, ethics, and strategy. With that framework, Alexander could see the big picture, plan long campaigns, and understand how different parts of a kingdom fit together. A quote from Aristotle's own writing, "The educated mind is the most powerful weapon," shows his belief that knowledge can be a tool for change. In Alexander's case, the tool helped him create one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. On the other hand, there is a strong argument that too much formal study can limit creativity. When a student follows a manual too closely, they may never try a new way of doing things. Some scholars have pointed out that Aristotle's method can make a student think that the only correct answer is the one written in the book. This can stop a person from looking for new solutions. Diogenes often mocked those who clung to written rules. He once said, "The dog is not a philosopher because it does not read." The joke hides a deeper point. A mind that only reads may miss the lessons that life itself teaches. In this view, the experiential path can keep a person open to surprise, to change, and to new ideas that a book might not contain. Both sides also have a counterpoint that warns against excess. The first counterargument says that formal study can sometimes trap a thinker inside a narrow box. If a student learns only from one teacher, they may adopt that teacher's biases without question. For Alexander, some historians note that his early reliance on Aristotle's ideas may have made him overconfident. When he reached the Indian subcontinent, he faced cultures that did not fit the Greek model of city-state. His attempt to impose Greek ideas on those peoples sometimes led to conflict. This shows that a heavy focus on theory can miss the practical needs of a different situation. The second counterargument warns that learning only by doing can leave a person without a deeper understanding of why things work. A child who learns to ride a bike by trial and error may become a good rider, but they might never understand the physics of balance, the geometry of the wheels, or the engineering of the frame. Similarly, Diogenes' followers could become skilled in surviving on the streets, but they might miss the chance to think about larger questions of justice, law, or the nature of the state. Aristotle's own words, "Knowing the cause of something is better than merely seeing its effect," capture the idea that theory can give a deeper insight that experience alone may not provide. Real-world applications of these ideas still appear today. In modern schools, teachers often debate whether to teach through projects and hands-on work or through lectures and textbooks. A science class that lets students build a simple circuit learns by experience, while a class that first reads about Ohm's law learns by theory. Both methods have value, and many educators try to blend them. The ancient debate between Diogenes and Alexander shows that this question is not new. It also shows that the balance between doing and reading can shape the way societies grow. Another modern example comes from the world of business. Some entrepreneurs start companies by trying out ideas in a garage, learning from each failure. Others go to business school, read case studies, and then launch a venture with a solid plan. Both paths can lead to success, but each path also carries risks. The garage method may miss strategic planning, while the school method may miss the quick adaptation that comes from real-world testing. The ancient contrast between experiential learning and formal schooling gives a clear picture of why both sides matter. In the story of Diogenes, there is also a small anecdote that shows his method working in a community. One winter, a group of poor children were shivering by the river. Diogenes gathered them, took a piece of broken pottery, and showed them how to patch it with clay and straw. He let the children feel the wet clay, press it into the cracks, and watch it harden in the sun. The children learned a skill that helped them repair their own pots, and they also learned the value of working together. The children later said, "We learned by touching the clay, not by reading about it." This story is often quoted to illustrate the power of learning by doing. A similar story from Alexander's life shows the power of debate and theory. While he was in Egypt, he visited the great library of Alexandria, a place full of scrolls and scholars. There he held a discussion with the philosopher Callisthenes about the nature of destiny. Callisthenes argued that the gods decide a man's fate, while Alexander replied, "I shape my own destiny with my sword." The conversation was recorded by a later historian who wrote, "Alexander's mind was sharpened by the words of the philosophers, yet his will was forged by his own hand." This anecdote highlights how formal study can give a person the language and concepts needed to argue, but the final decision still comes from personal action. The two anecdotes also show how each thinker used his method to influence others. Diogenes taught by example, letting his actions speak louder than his words. Alexander taught by speech, using philosophy to shape the thoughts of his officers and the people he conquered. Both methods can be powerful, and both can have limits. When the two approaches meet, a third idea can appear, the combination of experience and theory. Some scholars suggest that the best education mixes both. A student might first read about a concept, then go out and test it in the real world. In the ancient world, this mix was rare because the social classes that could read were few, and the streets were often seen as a place for the uneducated. Yet, there are hints that Alexander sometimes took his lessons from the battlefield and applied the theories he had learned. After the Battle of Issus, he wrote a short note to Aristotle, saying, "Your teachings on the golden mean helped me find the right balance between bold attack and careful defense." This line, though brief, shows that Alexander recognized the value of theory when it was put to use. The story also raises a question about the purpose of education. Is it to make a person useful in daily life, as Diogenes seemed to think? Or is it to give a person the tools to think about the world in a larger way, as Aristotle aimed for Alexander? The answer may depend on what a society values. In a city where survival depends on quick thinking and practical skills, Diogenes' method. Diogenes of Sinope walked the streets of Athens as if the city itself were a stage for a joke. He carried a lantern in broad daylight, saying that he was looking for an honest man. Passersby would stop, stare, and then laugh. The image of a philosopher who lived in a large clay jar, who ate only when a child offered a piece of fruit, and who would mock the fancy robes of the wealthy, stays vivid. In one famous scene, a young man offered Diogenes a cup of wine. The philosopher tossed the cup aside, claiming that a child could drink the same water from his hands. The crowd roared, some with amusement, others with irritation. Diogenes used the public space to test what society called proper. He showed that a simple life could point out the excesses of the crowd. Alexander the Great, on the other hand, moved through the public world as a commander who needed to rally his soldiers and his citizens. After the Battle of Issus, he stood on a hill and addressed the crowd that had gathered to hear the news. He spoke of the city he had just taken, of the gold he had won, and of the destiny that awaited his empire. He praised the bravery of his men, then turned to the local people and promised them protection if they accepted his rule. The speech was loud, full of confidence, and meant to bind the public to his cause. In another moment, after the siege of Tyre, Alexander climbed the walls and shouted to the defeated people, offering them a chance to join his army rather than face death. The public response was a mixture of fear and hope, but the scene showed how Alexander used public address to shape opinion and to cement his power. Both men used the public arena, but in opposite ways. Diogenes acted like a neighbor who would step into the yard of anyone who needed a laugh or a reminder of what truly mattered. He would sit on a bench in the market and ask a merchant why he spent so much on a gold necklace when a simple cloth could keep him warm. He would answer with a smile, "Better to have a clear mind than a heavy purse." His humor was a tool that forced people to look at their own habits. In a small town, a neighbor who helps everyone might bring bread to a sick family, fix a broken fence, or share a story that makes people think about kindness. Diogenes was that neighbor, but his help came as a mirror held up to society's vanity. Alexander, by contrast, was like a neighbor who kept a private garden, but opened it only for a grand feast. He built roads, founded cities, and spread Greek ideas, yet he also kept his inner circle tight. He would stand before a crowd, raise his sword, and speak of glory. He would also send letters to distant towns, telling them how to organize their markets and how to train their soldiers. His public life was a series of speeches, celebrations, and grand gestures that tied the people to his vision. A private garden neighbor might plant rare flowers and invite the whole street to a festival once a year, showing the fruits of his work, while still keeping the garden's secrets. One anecdote about Diogenes shows his willingness to confront social norms directly. When King Hipparchus of Athens insulted him, Diogenes walked into the king's palace and began to eat a raw onion in front of the royal court. He announced that the onion was a symbol of the simple life that the king could never understand. The court laughed, but the king's pride was wounded. The story spread, and people began to question the power of the elite. Another story tells how Diogenes met Alexander on the road to Corinth. Alexander, curious about the famous cynic, asked if he could do anything for him. Diogenes replied, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." The philosopher turned his face to the sun and walked away, leaving Alexander to stare at the empty space. The tale was recorded by later writers and used to illustrate how a simple refusal could challenge a mighty ruler. Alexander's public speeches after battles served a different purpose. After the Battle of Gaugamela, he addressed his troops, reminding them that the Persian king had tried to stop them, but that their courage had won. He said, "There is nothing impossible to him who will try." The words lifted morale and turned a victory into a legend. Later, when he entered Egypt, he stood before the people of Memphis and declared that he respected the gods of the land. He offered to build a temple for the god Osiris, showing that he could blend his own culture with the local one. These acts made the crowd feel that Alexander cared about their traditions, even as he spread his own ideas. The first counterargument to the idea that public engagement is always good is that it can dilute personal values. When a philosopher spends too much time in the public eye, the pressure to please the crowd can push him to soften his critique. If Diogenes had tried to win applause instead of mocking the crowd, his message would have become less sharp. The more he tried to fit into the expectations of the market, the less he would have been able to point out the absurdities. In modern terms, a social media influencer who starts with strong ideas may end up watering down those ideas to gain likes. The original purpose gets lost, and the voice becomes an echo of popular opinion rather than a challenge to it. A second counterargument is that isolation can breed misunderstanding. When a thinker stays hidden in a garden, others may imagine him as a saint or a monster, depending on the rumors that spread. Alexander's private moments, such as his night in the palace where he consulted the oracle, were often turned into myths that made him seem either divine or cruel. The lack of direct contact allowed stories to grow unchecked. In the case of Diogenes, if he had never spoken in the market, later readers might have thought his ideas were only for the elite, not for everyday people. The absence of public interaction can let false ideas fill the gap, leading to a distorted picture of the thinker's true stance. Both counterarguments tie back to the earlier discussion of freedom and ethics. Freedom, in the sense of being able to act without external pressure, can be threatened when a public figure feels forced to please a crowd. Ethics, in the sense of staying true to one's moral compass, can be compromised if the crowd's values differ from the thinker's. Diogenes chose a life that seemed free because he rejected the crowd's demands. Yet his public mockery showed that he was still bound to the city's eyes. Alexander, who claimed to be free to conquer, used public speeches to shape his ethical image, showing that freedom can be performed for an audience. Real-world applications of these ideas appear today in community activism and leadership. A modern activist who walks the streets, talks to shop owners, and asks them why they price food so high, follows the pattern of Diogenes. The activist uses public presence to point out injustice, hoping the crowd will see the problem and change. A corporate CEO who gives a keynote speech after a merger, promising new jobs and growth, mirrors Alexander's public address. The CEO's words aim to calm investors and employees, showing how public speech can bind people to a shared vision. Modern interpretations also bring new angles. Some scholars view Diogenes as an early proponent of what is now called social critique through humor. They argue that his public jokes were a way to protect himself while still speaking truth. Others see Alexander's speeches as early examples of political branding, where a leader creates a story about himself that people can rally around. Both views highlight how the public stage can be used for influence, whether to challenge or to lead. An analogy can help clarify the difference. Imagine a town square with a single tree. Diogenes is like a wind that rustles the leaves, making people notice the tree's shape. He does not move the tree, but he makes people think about it. Alexander is like a gardener who trims the branches, decides which fruit to grow, and then invites the townspeople to a festival under the tree. The gardener shapes the tree's future, while the wind simply points out what already exists. A second analogy uses the idea of a classroom. Diogenes is the student who asks the teacher why a rule exists, forcing the class to discuss the purpose of the rule. Alexander is the teacher who writes a new rule on the board, explains why it matters, and expects the class to follow it. Both have influence, but one questions, the other creates. Historical anecdotes add depth. In 336 BC, when Alexander's father, King Philip, was assassinated, the city of Babylon held a public mourning. Alexander entered the city and gave a speech that promised stability and continuity. He stood on a balcony, looked over the crowd, and said, "I will keep the city safe." The people cheered, and the city's markets reopened. This moment shows how a public address can turn a crisis into a chance for order. Another anecdote involves Diogenes' encounter with a wealthy patron who offered him a golden cup. Diogenes accepted the cup, then smashed it on the ground, shouting, "This is the weight of greed." The crowd gasped, and the patron's reputation suffered. The story spread, and other rich men began to think twice before flaunting their wealth. The episode illustrates how a public act of mockery can shift social values. Quotes from primary sources give voice to the thinkers. Diogenes is recorded as saying, "I am looking for an honest man." The line appears in the writings of Diogenes Laertius, who noted the philosopher's habit of walking with a lantern. The simple sentence captures the idea of searching for truth in a noisy world. Alexander, in a letter to his friend Hephaestion, wrote, "There is nothing impossible to him who will try." The phrase, found in the ancient collection of his letters, shows his belief that effort can overcome limits. Both quotes are short, clear, and can be spoken aloud to illustrate each thinker's core belief. Connecting these scenes to the earlier sections on freedom and ethics, it becomes clear that public interaction is a double-edged sword. For Diogenes, the freedom to mock came with the risk of being dismissed as a fool. His ethics demanded honesty, even if that meant offending the crowd. For Alexander, the freedom to speak to large audiences gave him power, but also forced him to shape his ethics to fit the expectations of his soldiers and subjects. The balance between staying true to one's values and reaching out to society is a tension that both men lived with. In a modern setting, a teacher who stands before a class and asks why a rule exists is practicing Diogenes-style engagement. The teacher may risk being labeled disruptive, but the act can spark deeper understanding. A politician who gives a televised address after a natural disaster is following Alexander's pattern. The speech can bring aid, but it also can be used to boost the politician's image. Both roles show how public interaction can be a tool for change, but also a source of pressure. The final picture of their relationship with society is like two sides of a coin. One side reflects the public as a mirror, used to show what is wrong. The other side reflects the public as a canvas, used to paint a new picture. Diogenes chose the mirror. Alexander chose the canvas. Their choices still echo today in how people decide to engage with the world. Some prefer to stand in the middle of the street, shouting jokes that make strangers think. Others prefer to stand on a balcony, delivering speeches that guide crowds toward a shared goal. Both paths have value, and both have pitfalls. When a community thinks about how to act, it can ask, is the goal to expose hidden flaws, as Diogenes did? Or is the goal to unite people under a common purpose, as Alexander did? The answer may depend on the situation, the audience, and the personal values of the one who steps into the public space. The balance between critique and leadership, between isolation and engagement, remains a central question for anyone who wishes to live a life of meaning. In conclusion, the ways Diogenes and Alexander dealt with society illustrate two powerful approaches. One uses humor and mockery in the open market to shake people out of complacency. The other uses grand speeches and public ceremonies to build a shared vision. Both methods can protect freedom, but they can also test ethics. The counter-arguments remind that too much public approval can water down a message, while too much isolation can let. The story of Diogenes and the story of Alexander the Great have traveled far beyond the streets of ancient Athens and the battlefields of Persia. Their ideas have been taken up, reshaped, and sometimes misread by people who lived centuries later. In this part of the tale, the focus turns to the ways later minds have borrowed from both men, the ways they have been quoted, the ways they have been used to guide modern life, and the ways their fame can hide the true depth of their thoughts. When the Roman Stoics began to write about how to live a good life, they often pointed to the lone figure of Diogenes. The Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus, for example, told his students that a simple life was the best shield against desire. He said that a man who can live with only a cloak and a bowl is already richer than a king with a palace. In a letter to a friend, the Stoic Seneca recalled a story that had been told about Diogenes walking in daylight with a lantern, saying he was looking for an honest man. Seneca wrote, "If a man can hold a lantern in the bright sun, his search is not for a man but for virtue itself." By using that image, The Roman thinkers showed that Diogenes' disdain for luxury could become a tool for building inner strength. They did not copy every detail of his life. They kept the core idea that freedom comes from needing little. The same kind of borrowing happened with Alexander's ambition. In the Middle Ages, crusaders marched across Europe and the Holy Land with banners that sometimes bore the name of Alexander. One chronicler, William of Tyre, recorded a speech given to a group of knights before a siege. He wrote that the leader reminded them of Alexander's famous line, "There is nothing impossible to him who will try." The knights were told that if Alexander could cross the desert and climb the peaks of the world, then no enemy could stop them. The quote was used to fire up courage, to turn a distant ancient conqueror into a model for modern soldiers. The Crusaders did not study Alexander's tactics in detail. They used his boldness as a rallying cry. Modern minimalists also turned to Diogenes for inspiration. A popular blog on simple living opens with the story of the philosopher who lived in a barrel and rejected the trappings of wealth. The writer says, "When Diogenes tossed away his possessions, he showed that happiness does not need a big house." The blog then lists steps such as own only what you can carry and spend time in nature, not in malls. The influence is clear. The ancient cynic becomes a brand for a lifestyle that values less, not more. The writer even quotes Diogenes, "I am looking for an honest man," to suggest that the search for truth is more important than the search for things. Leaders in the business world have also taken Alexander's words into their speeches. In a famous address to a group of entrepreneurs, a CEO began with the line, "Alexander once said, 'I am not afraid of an army of lions.'" He went on to explain that the quote meant that fear of competition should not stop a company from moving forward. The audience heard the ancient king's confidence turned into a lesson on market risk. The CEO did not claim to follow Alexander's military plans. He used the spirit of the quote to push for bold decisions. These examples show how both figures have become symbols that can be adapted to many contexts. The core ideas, simplicity for Diogenes, ambition for Alexander, have been turned into tools for ethics, for personal growth, for leadership, and for political rhetoric. The influence stretches from the ancient world to the present day, and it continues to grow. Yet the path from original thought to modern use is not always straight. One counterargument says that the legacy of both men can be misinterpreted. When a modern minimalist says that Diogenes proved that money is evil, the nuance is lost. Diogenes did not claim that wealth itself is bad. He argued that desire for wealth can trap a person in false comfort. He used his own poverty as a mirror to show that people can be free when they stop chasing more. If a reader hears only the surface claim, "Money is evil," the deeper lesson about desire is missed. A second counterargument points out that fame can oversimplify complex ideas. Alexander's name is often linked with the phrase, "reach for the stars." But the real Alexander was also a ruler who ordered harsh punishments, who sometimes acted out of personal pride rather than pure vision. When a leader quotes Alexander's ambition without acknowledging the darker side of his conquests, the picture becomes a one-sided hero story. The same happens with Diogenes. Some people think of him only as a comic figure who walked around with a lantern. In truth, he was also a sharp critic of social norms, a teacher who challenged the powerful, and a thinker who asked deep questions about what it means to live well. Reducing him to a joke strips away the power of his critique. These counterpoints do not mean that the influence of Diogenes and Alexander is meaningless. Rather, they remind the listener to look past the easy slogans. The earlier part of the video talked about ethics and power. Diogenes taught that ethics can be found in a life free from excess, while Alexander showed how power can be used to shape the world. When modern people pick up a quote, They should ask what the original thinker meant about the balance between desire and duty, between personal freedom and social responsibility. A useful analogy helps to see this balance. Imagine a garden that has two kinds of plants. One plant, the cactus, needs very little water and thrives in harsh soil. It represents Diogenes' way of living with little. The other plant, a tall oak, grows fast and spreads its branches wide, reaching for the sky. It stands for Alexander's drive to expand. Both plants can live in the same garden, but they need different care. If a gardener only waters the oak and ignores the cactus, the garden becomes unbalanced. If the gardener only tends the cactus, the garden may lack shade and shelter. The lesson is that both simplicity and ambition have a place, but each must be understood in its own context. Historical anecdotes illustrate how the two ideas have been mixed in practice. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote in his diary, "When I think of Diogenes, I see the value of a clear mind." Marcus was a Stoic ruler who tried to blend the discipline of the Stoics with the practical demands of empire. He would sometimes walk the palace corridors in plain shoes, recalling Diogenes' disdain for fancy attire, while still making decisions that affected millions. His diary entry shows a ruler who tried to keep the ethical simplicity of the Cynic while holding great power. Another anecdote comes from the time of the Crusades. In 1191, during the siege of Acre, a commander named Richard the Lionheart is recorded to have said, "We march as Alexander did, with the sun at our backs." He used Alexander's image as a rallying point, but he also ordered his men to share food with the local poor, a gesture that echoes Diogenes' concern for the common folk. The story shows that even in a war of conquest, the two legacies could be woven together, creating a complex picture of ambition tempered by a hint of humility. Modern interpretations keep this tension alive. In contemporary philosophy classes, professors often assign a short reading of Diogenes' actions and then ask students to write about how those actions could apply to today's consumer culture. At the same time, business schools sometimes include a case study on Alexander's empire building as an example of strategic planning. The two topics sit side by side in curricula, showing that the ancient pair still teach about both moral choice and effective leadership. Real-world applications appear in everyday decisions. A person who chooses to live in a tiny house may cite Diogenes as a model for cutting away unnecessary possessions. That same person might also set a career goal of starting a small non-profit that reaches many people, echoing Alexander's desire to have a broad impact. The combination of a simple lifestyle with a big vision reflects how both legacies can be blended in a single life. Leaders in politics also draw on the two figures. A mayor of a small town once gave a speech that began, "Like Diogenes, I will not be swayed by the glitter of big developers. Like Alexander, I will work to bring new opportunities to our streets." The mayor used the two names to show a balance, resisting greed while still aiming for growth. The audience heard a clear message that ethics and power need not be at odds. Quotes from primary sources help to keep the original voices alive. Diogenes is recorded as saying, "I am looking for an honest man." Alexander is recorded as saying, "There is nothing impossible to him who will try." These short lines capture the heart of each thinker. When a modern speaker repeats them, the audience hears a direct line from the past, not a paraphrase. The power of a quote lies in its ability to cut through the noise and speak straight to the mind. The influence of Diogenes can also be seen in the art world. A contemporary sculptor created a piece that looks like a cracked clay pot with a single candle inside. The artist explained that the pot represents the barrel of Diogenes, while the candle is the lantern he used to search for honesty. The work now hangs in a museum that also displays a painting of Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, rearing against a stormy sky. The curator wrote in the exhibit guide, "Both works ask us to think about what we value, the quiet of a simple life or the roar of a great adventure." The museum's pairing of the two pieces shows how the legacies can be displayed side by side, prompting visitors to compare and reflect. Even popular music sometimes references the two figures. A folk singer released a song titled "Barrel and Crown." The verses tell of a man who lives in a barrel, laughing at the rich, and a king who rides a horse across deserts, dreaming of new lands. The chorus repeats, "Give me a lantern, give me a sword, and I will find my way." The song uses the images of Diogenes and Alexander to talk about personal freedom and bold dreams in a modern world. The way the two legacies have been used also shows a pattern. People often pick the part that fits their need. A person who feels overwhelmed by consumer pressure may latch onto Diogenes' rejection of wealth. A person who feels stuck in a small job may latch onto Alexander's drive to conquer new horizons. The pattern is useful to notice because it reminds listeners that the original thinkers offered more than a single slogan. They offered a whole way of looking at life, with strengths and limits. The earlier theme of ethics versus power reappears here. Diogenes showed that a life of virtue does not need a throne. Alexander showed that a throne can be used to spread ideas far and wide. When the two are placed together, a question emerges. Can a person be both ethically pure and powerful? The answer is not simple, but the stories of both men give clues. Diogenes proved that a person can be powerful in the sense of being free from fear of loss. Alexander proved that power can be a tool for change, for better or for worse. A final anecdote brings the two together in a surprising way. In the early 20th century, a writer named H.L. Mencken visited a museum in Berlin and saw a statue of Diogenes holding a lantern. He then walked to a nearby cafe where a group of scholars were debating Alexander's tactics. Mencken wrote later, "I saw the lamp of truth and the sword of ambition in the same city, and I felt that the world still needs both." His observation shows that even a century ago, people recognized the need for both simplicity and ambition. To sum up, the legacy of Diogenes and the legacy of Alexander have traveled far earlier. The video described how Diogenes lived in a barrel and how Alexander rode a horse across the world. The two lives still sit side by side in the mind. Now the discussion turns to the scholarly debates that weigh the strengths and the weaknesses of each philosophy. The tone stays calm. The words stay simple. The story moves like a gentle river. The first image that many scholars use is a kitchen. One philosophy is a recipe that uses only a few ingredients. The other is a recipe that mixes many spices, sauces, and long cooking times. The Diogenes recipe calls for a single loaf of bread, a cup of water, and a clear mind. The Alexander recipe calls for many meats, many wines, many spices, and a large fire. Both recipes can fill a belly, but they do so in different ways. The debate asks which meal is better for a healthy life. Supporters of the Diogenes recipe point out that it teaches self-control. The ancient cynic said, "Why look for an honest man, but I cannot find one?" That line shows a clear focus on virtue, not on wealth. The strength of that view is that it removes the need for constant comparison. A person who follows the simple path can avoid the stress of competition. Modern minimalists often quote Diogenes to explain why they own only a few items. In everyday life, the lesson can look like a person who walks to work instead of buying a car. The simple act saves money, saves time, and keeps the mind clear. Supporters of the Alexander recipe argue that ambition can lift whole societies. Alexander's own words, "I am not afraid of an army of lions. I am afraid of an army of sheep without a shepherd," show a belief in strong leadership. The strength of that view is that it can bring order, build roads, and spread ideas. History records that after Alexander's conquests, cities like Alexandria grew into centers of learning. The spread of Greek language helped later scholars translate ancient texts. In a modern setting, the Alexander style can look like a startup founder who builds a company that creates jobs for many people. Scholars who studied the two philosophies do not only list strengths, they also list weaknesses. The first major weakness of the Diogenes way is that it can seem impossible to live in a world full of bills and families. A 19th century philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer wrote a short essay that called Diogenes the Dreamer Who Forgets the Weight of the World. Schopenhauer argued that the Cynic's rejection of comfort ignored the real need for shelter and food. He said, "A man cannot live on ideas alone. He must eat, and he must be protected from the cold." That criticism shows how some thinkers see the Diogenes path as impractical for most people. The second major weakness of the Alexander way is its moral cost. A 20th century historian named Mary Beard examined the Macedonian campaigns and asked, how many lives were lost for the sake of a name? She wrote, "The glory of a city built on the bones of conquered towns is a heavy burden to bear." Beard's point is that ambition can bring destruction as easily as it brings progress. The historian's question makes the audience think about the price of empire. These two anecdotes are often quoted in classrooms. They give a human face to the abstract ideas. The story of Schopenhauer's criticism reminds listeners that a philosophy that looks good on paper may clash with daily needs. The story of Beard's question reminds listeners that great power can hide a dark side. Now the debate moves to counterarguments. Some scholars say that the criticism of Diogenes forgets his personal context. Diogenes lived in a city where wealth was displayed openly. He chose the barrel as a protest against that display. When a critic says his path is impossible, the scholar replies, he was not trying to give a recipe for everyone. He was showing a mirror to a specific society. The counterargument says that judging the cynic by modern standards can miss the point of his protest. Other scholars say that the praise of Alexander can ignore the negative outcomes. When people talk about the spread of Greek culture, they sometimes forget the loss of local languages, the forced relocations, and the wars that killed thousands. A counterpoint notes, a ruler who builds libraries also builds walls. This view asks the audience to look at the whole picture, not just the bright parts. Both counterarguments ask the listener to keep balance. The balance is like a scale that holds two plates. One plate has the simple life, the other plate has the ambitious life. If one plate is too heavy, the scale tips. The scholarly debates try to keep the scale level. Real-world applications of the two philosophies can be seen today. In the world of work, some companies adopt a Thalian model. They keep only what is needed, cut waste, and focus on core values. That model echoes Diogenes' call for a life without excess. Other companies adopt a growth model. They seek new markets, acquire other firms, and aim for global reach. That model echoes Alexander's drive to expand. A concrete example of the simple model is a family that chooses to live in a tiny house. They buy only what fits in a small space, grow some food in a garden, and travel by bike. Their life shows how the Diogenes idea can reduce stress and lower bills. A concrete example of the ambitious model is a city that invests in a new subway line. The project costs billions, creates many jobs, and reshapes the city's layout. The city's leaders see the project as a way to connect people and boost the economy, much like Alexander's roads connected distant lands. Another everyday analogy helps the listener. Imagine two gardeners. One gardener plants a single sturdy oak tree. He waters it, protects it, and lets it grow for many years. The other gardener plants many fast-growing vines. He watches them climb quickly, covering the garden in a short time. The oak represents the Diogenes path, slow, deep, lasting. The vines represent the Alexander path, fast, wide, sometimes invasive. Both gardeners hope for shade, but their methods differ. Historical anecdotes add color. The first anecdote comes from the time when Alexander met Diogenes in Corinth. The story says that Alexander asked, "What can I do for you?" Diogenes, lying in the sun, replied, "Stand out of my light." That brief exchange shows the clash of power and simplicity. The second anecdote comes from a later period, when a Roman writer named Plutarch recorded that Diogenes once walked into a banquet hall, ate a simple bean, and laughed at the lavish feast. The story shows how the cynic used humor to point out excess. These stories are often used by teachers to illustrate the tension between the two ways. They also help the viewer see how ideas travel across time. The ancient meeting in Corinth still feels like a modern conversation between a CEO and a minimalist blogger. The scholarly debate also looks at how each philosophy handles the idea of happiness. Diogenes says happiness comes from freedom from desire. He believed that wanting less makes the mind calm. Alexander, on the other hand, seemed to think that happiness comes from achieving great deeds and being remembered. He built monuments and named cities after himself. Modern psychologists note that both ideas have truth. Some research shows that people who focus on relationships and purpose feel more satisfied, which matches Diogenes' view. Other research shows that setting big goals can give a sense of direction, which matches Alexander's view. When the video returns to the earlier sections, it can remind the listener of the definition of cynicism that was given before. Cynicism, in the ancient sense, means living according to nature and rejecting artificial comforts. The earlier section also explained how Alexander's philosophy of conquest was tied to the idea of bareti, a Greek word for excellence. Those definitions still matter in the comparative critique. Now the script turns to the question of how to apply the critique in everyday life. One listener might wonder whether to follow the simple path or the ambitious path. The answer, according to many scholars, is not a strict choice. It is more like mixing two recipes. A person can keep a simple diet most days, but add a special dish for celebrations. That mix respects both the need for calm and the need for growth. A modern philosopher named Alain de Botton once wrote, "The best life is a balance between comfort and challenge." That line captures the middle ground that many scholars suggest. The balance does not mean half and half all the time. It means listening to the inner voice that asks for peace and the outer voice that asks for progress. The debate also raises the issue of legacy. Diogenes left few written words, but his actions inspired many later thinkers. Alexander left many cities, but also left a trail of war. The question becomes, which legacy is more valuable? Some historians argue that ideas that survive without bloodshed are stronger. Others argue that ideas that change the map of the world have a bigger impact. Both sides bring evidence. One more counterargument appears when scholars examine the role of personal context. Diogenes grew up in a wealthy family, but chose poverty. Some argue that his choice was a privilege because he could afford to give up wealth. Others say his choice was a protest that only a person with resources could make. The counterargument reminds the audience that personal background shapes philosophy. Similarly, Alexander's background mattered. He was the son of a king, trained by Aristotle, and raised with the belief that he was destined for greatness. Critics who blame him for cruelty may ignore the pressure of his upbringing. The counterargument says that a ruler cannot be judged without seeing the expectations placed on him. In the end, the scholarly debates do not settle on a single answer. They keep the conversation alive. They ask the viewer to think about what kind of recipe fits their own life. They ask the viewer to consider whether a single oak tree or many vines best serve the garden they tend. The video concludes this segment by reminding the listener of the two earlier sections. The first section described Diogenes' belief that virtue is enough. The second section described Alexander's belief that power can spread culture. Those ideas still echo in the comparative critiques. The critiques add depth, showing that each philosophy has bright spots and dark spots. The final thought is simple. Life is like cooking. Some meals need few ingredients and a slow simmer. Some meals need many spices and a hot fire. Both can be good. The wise cook knows when to use each method. The wise thinker can learn from both Diogenes and Alexander, taking the calm of the barrel and the drive of the horse and mixing them into a recipe that fits the world today. In the modern world, the clash between the ideas of Diogenes and Alexander the Great feels like a quiet conversation that happens inside every person who must pick a path. One side says that a life of simple needs and honest work brings true freedom. The other side says that bold ambition and the drive to shape the world are the keys to success. Both ideas still speak to the choices people make about jobs, buying things, and growing as human beings. When a person looks at a glossy job ad that promises a high salary, a fancy office, and a title that glitters, the voice of Alexander can be heard. Alexander believed that a strong will and a clear vision could move mountains. He once said, "There is nothing impossible to him who will try." In his own life, he chased the dream of a world united under his rule. He crossed deserts, climbed high peaks, and built cities that still bear his name. The story of his march into India shows how far a single mind can go when it refuses to stop. A modern tech entrepreneur named Maya Patel feels this pull every day. She grew up in a small town, watching her parents work long hours at a factory. She dreamed of building something that could change how people talk to each other. After college, she started a small app that let people share short videos. Investors called her the next Alexander because she seemed to have a plan to conquer the market. She raised millions, hired a team, and moved into a sleek office downtown. Her days are filled with meetings, product launches, and a constant race to be first. When she looks at her reflection in the glass wall, she sees the same fire that drove Alexander to stand on the edge of the world's known map. On the other side of the city, a community activist named Luis Ramirez lives a life that echoes Diogenes. He walks barefoot through the streets, carrying only a small bag of tools to fix broken benches in the park. He lives in a modest apartment with only the basics: a bed, a table, a few books, and a small garden on the balcony. He often quotes Diogenes, "I am looking for an honest man," when people ask why he gives up comforts. He believes that owning less lets him focus on helping others. He spends his mornings teaching kids how to grow food in tiny spaces, and his afternoons cleaning up graffiti. He says that the real wealth is the smile of a child who finally eats a fresh tomato from the garden. Both Maya and Luis face the same question. What does it mean to be free? Maya thinks freedom is the power to shape markets, to lead people toward new ideas, and to build an empire of influence. Luis thinks freedom is the ability to live without being tied to a boss, without needing to chase a paycheck that never feels enough, and without letting possessions dictate his mood. The ancient debate between Alexander's ambition and Diophantus' simplicity becomes a living conversation in their daily choices. When Maya looks at her bank statements, she sees numbers that grow each month. She can afford a new car, a larger house, and trips to exotic places. Yet she also feels a pressure to keep expanding, to stay ahead of competitors, to prove that her vision is still worth the risk. The idea that wealth is a sign of power, that Alexander once held, can make her feel safe. But it also makes her wonder if she is chasing a dream that never ends. She sometimes hears the words of a Roman historian who wrote about Alexander. He was a man who wanted to be a god among men. That line reminds her that the desire for greatness can become a trap. Luis, on the other hand, watches his utility bills stay low, his possessions stay few, and his heart stay open. He remembers a story about Diogenes living in a large ceramic jar in Athens, choosing a space that was barely enough to sit in. Diogenes used that jar to show that a person does not need a palace to be content. Luis feels that each time he fixes a broken bench, he builds a small piece of freedom for his neighbors. He also remembers a line from Diogenes. "I threw away my cup when I saw a child drinking from his hands." That quote tells him that true happiness can be found in the simplest acts, not in the size of a house. Both stories show how the old ideas can help people think about modern life. Maya's path shows how ambition can lead to inventions that help millions. Luis' path shows how a simple life can bring people together and make neighborhoods stronger. The question is whether one must choose one side or can blend the two. One counter-argument says that modern life does not allow a pure choice. The world today is built on complex systems that need money, technology, and cooperation. A person who wants to live like Diogenes may find it hard to pay rent in a city where housing costs are high. A person who wants to be like Alexander may find that a single vision cannot succeed without a team, without compromise, without listening to others. The need for compromise is real. A small business owner may have to take a loan, hire staff, and market aggressively. That means adopting some of Alexander's tactics while still trying to keep a simple lifestyle. The balance becomes a dance between ambition and humility. A second counter-argument says that pure minimalism may be unrealistic for many. Diogenes praised living with almost nothing, but most people today need at least a stable job, healthcare, and a safe place to sleep. The idea of throwing away all possessions can feel like a luxury that only a few can afford. In a world where social safety nets are thin, a person may need to earn enough to protect themselves and their family. That need can push them toward the kind of career that Alexander would admire. The modern world often tells people that they must work hard, earn more, and buy more to stay safe. That message can make the simple life seem impossible. Even with those objections, the core ideas still matter. The earlier discussion about freedom, wealth, and ethics can be linked back here. Freedom, in the sense of being able to choose how to spend one's time, is something both thinkers cared about. Alexander saw freedom as the ability to move armies, to cross borders, to decide the fate of nations. Diogenes saw freedom as being free from the need for others' approval, free from material cravings. Wealth, for Alexander, was a tool to fund his campaigns and to build monuments. For Diogenes, wealth was a burden that could cloud judgment. Ethics, the sense of right and wrong, appears in both lives. Alexander claimed that his conquests were for the glory of Greece and for the spread of civilization. Diogenes claimed that living honestly and simply was the most ethical way to be. Modern people can look at those ideas and ask, does a big paycheck make one more ethical, or does a simple life make one more honest? Consider the example of a young teacher named Emma, who decides to stay in a small town instead of moving to a big city for a higher salary. She chooses to earn less, to live in a modest house, and to spend her evenings tutoring kids for free. Emma feels a quiet joy that resembles Diogenes' contentment. She says, "I can see the change in each child's eyes, and that is my wealth." Her story shows how a simple life can bring deep meaning. Now think of a scientist named Dr. Karim, who leads a large research team working on renewable energy. He travels to conferences, writes papers, and raises funds from big investors. He sees his work as a way to change the planet, much like Alexander tried to change the world he saw. Dr. Karim says, When we create a new source of clean power, we give people the freedom to live without fear of pollution. His story shows how ambition can be used for a larger good. Both Emma and Dr. Karim illustrate how the ancient ideas can be applied in different ways. The key is not to pick one side blindly, but to ask what values matter most at each moment. The ancient debate becomes a guide, not a rule. An analogy can help. Imagine life as a garden. Alexander's approach is like planting a fast-growing tree that reaches high and shades a large area. It needs strong roots, lots of water, and careful pruning. Diogenes' approach is like planting a low-lying herb that spreads slowly, needs little water, and can be harvested many times. Both can provide food, but they do so in different ways. A gardener may choose to have both, a tall tree for fruit and a herb for daily use. In the same way, a modern person may aim for a career that brings influence while also keeping a simple home that offers peace. Historical anecdotes add color to the picture. One story tells how Alexander once visited the oracle of Ammon in the Egyptian desert. He asked the priest if he would become a god. The priest answered, "You will be a great king, but you will not become a god." This moment reminded Alexander that even great power has limits. Another story tells how Diogenes, when asked why he lived in a jar, answered, "Because a jar is enough for a man who knows what he needs." That reply showed his belief that happiness does not depend on wealth. These stories still matter today. When a startup founder faces a decision about selling his company, the memory of Alexander's ambition can push him to keep growing, to aim for a larger impact. When a person feels overwhelmed by consumer ads, the memory of Diogenes' jar can remind them that a few simple things can be enough. In the realm of consumerism, the modern market constantly tells people that buying the newest phone, the biggest house, or the fanciest car will bring happiness. The voice of Alexander says, "Take what you can and make it yours." The voice of Diogenes says, "Ask if you truly need it." A person who buys a new phone every year may feel a short burst of excitement, but later wonder if the cost was worth the fleeting thrill. A person who chooses to keep an older phone, to repair it, and to use it for what it can do, may find more time to read, to walk, or to talk with friends. Both choices have consequences for personal growth and for the planet. Personal growth also follows the same pattern. Alexander's path encourages setting big goals, taking risks, and learning from failures. It teaches that growth often comes from stepping out of comfort zones. Diogenes' path encourages looking inward, questioning what truly matters, and stripping away distractions. It teaches that growth can happen by listening to one's own thoughts and by living in a way that matches one's values. When a person thinks about career choices, they can ask, do they want a job that offers a high salary and a title, or do they want a job that offers meaning and a simple routine? The answer may change over time. Some people start with ambition, climb a corporate ladder, and later switch to a simpler life that focuses on community. Others start with simplicity, learn to be content, and later use that stability to launch a bold project. The ancient debate shows that both routes are possible and that each can feed the other. In the end, the ideas of Diogenes and Alexander are not locked in a fight. They are two lenses that help people see the world. The lens of ambition can sharpen focus on goals, inspire innovation, and push society forward. The lens of simplicity can soften the edges of stress, remind people of what truly matters, and protect the environment. Modern life, with its fast pace and endless options, can benefit from looking through both lenses at once. A final quote from Alexander, recorded by the historian Plutarch, says, "I am not afraid of an army of lions. I am afraid of an army without a leader." This line tells us that direction matters more than size. A person who follows a clear purpose, even with modest means, can achieve great things. A quote from Diogenes, found in the writings of Diogenes Laertius, says, "He has the most who is content with the least." This line tells us that true wealth can be found in being satisfied with what one has. The modern relevance of these ancient ideas lies in the daily choices each person makes. Whether it is deciding to buy a new gadget or to repair an old one, whether it is choosing a high-profile job or a modest role that serves a community, whether it is aiming for fame or seeking inner peace, the thoughts of Diogenes and Alexander provide a map. The map does not tell every step, but it points to two important landmarks: freedom and responsibility. Freedom to choose, and responsibility to consider how that choice affects oneself and others. In a world that often feels like a race, the voice of Diogenes whispers, "Slow down, look inside, be honest." The voice of Alexander shouts, "Move forward, think big, lead." Listening to